Welcome to the third in our series on trying to understand the things that Christians say. This week our theme is love the sinner, hate the sin. Our gospel reading today opened with these words: Then Jesus told this story to some who had great confidence in their own righteousness and scorned everyone else. So can I ask you, I wonder what goes through your mind when you see a transvestite, a person or a picture. I wonder what your gut reaction is. I wonder what you think of a person going through gender replacement surgery, or a man who now says that he identifies as a woman. I wonder what your gut reaction is. I wasn't sure I was even going to include this phrase as part of our series, partly because I feel like there isn't really that much to say about it, because for me it seems all fairly straightforward, I think. But let's take some time. Here goes. So the problem with the phrase, just to say it right up front, the problem with the phrase love the sinner and hate the sin is as the gospel describes it today. Some had great confidence in their own righteousness and scorned everyone else. The thing is, we all have different standards for what we define as sin. So, for example, in America, it's remarkable that despite an epidemic of mass shootings in which children and young people are regularly killed, guns still are worshipped. And the right to bear arms is protected with really nothing less than a religious zeal. And yet, many who defend the right of citizens to carry weapons of war are also, interestingly, fervently anti-abortion. So they are people who are picky about who can be killed, when and where. It's because we all have different standards for what we define as sin. In our own country, the National Party government was fanatical about keeping nudity out of the media in South Africa in those years. They were certain that the sight of a woman's breasts would lead to the destruction of civilization and eternal damnation for us all. And yet, whilst they were being protective about that, they slept soundly and worshipped heartily as their prejudice and their policies and their violence created unimaginable cruelty for millions of people over decades. It's because we all have different standards for what we define as sin. Jesus told the story to some who had great confidence in their own righteousness and scorned everyone else. And so it keeps going, and it will keep going in human history. So today, some heterosexual people have great confidence in their own righteousness and scorn everyone else who isn't heterosexual. So convinced that they have the moral superiority on sexuality, they gladly condemn, mock, or eviscerate those who are different. And some are bold enough to claim God's support for their convictions as they stand confident in their own righteousness. Yet a simple look at heterosexual behavior will reveal that there are high divorce rates, often through infidelity, a voracious appetite for pornography, child abuse, and instances of incomprehensible depravity all form a part of the broader heterosexual lifestyle. It's that we all have different standards for what we define as sin. And on this issue of sexuality, the church is slow to confess its duplicity. If you read the scriptures, both Old and New Testaments, you'll discover that one of the few major themes, one of the few major strands of our entire scripture is economic justice. Not just justice as a whole, but economic justice. That those of us who have should share what we have with the poor, not in small measure, not with charitable gifts, but with radical generosity. One day I hope to do a sermon on the radical nature of biblical economics, but not for today. And of course we don't want to hear that, so we ignore it. I don't want to hear about the radical generosity of biblical economics. It's far too threatening to my bank account. And so we'd rather speak about other people's sex lives than worry about or talk about our own wallets. It's because we all have different standards for what we define as sin. We also need to say today that our judgment of others is actually a very complicated thing, and we again won't spend too much time on it, but it's worth noting that it is a complicated thing. Sometimes we hate in others what we really hate in ourselves. Sometimes we hate in others what we fear might be true about ourselves. Sometimes we hate in others what is hurt or broken in us, and we see it in others and we judge them for that. It's always a worthy warning signal when someone protests too much. Sometimes we hate in others what we've been taught to hate by our parents or our priests or our teachers or our peers. The reality is that we can never be truly confident in our own righteousness, for our own righteousness is never more than a house of cards built upon our own fears, prejudices, and pains and hurts. So finally, let's get back to that statement for the day. Love the sinner and hate the sin. Some observations for us to take away. Firstly, let's acknowledge together that statement is actually nothing more than a cop-out. It's an attempt to cover our judgmental attitude with Christian-sounding language. It's an attempt to wrap a curse in the language of love. So I would say, if we wish to judge another person, let's just be honest about it. Don't try and dress it up in religious jargon. Secondly, to notice that the phrase is not biblical in any manner whatsoever. Scripture never tells us to love the sinner. It only ever tells us that we all are sinners, we all fall short of the glory of God, and we are told that we need to love our neighbors. So no one gets to decide exclusively who is a sinner, as if somehow they are not and are on some kind of moral high ground that gives them permission to do so. The biblical witness is that we're all in the same boat, and the call of Scripture is that we behave lovingly towards all who are on board. To include any phrase that suggests we should hate anything in a person is dangerous ground. Thirdly, and I struggle to know what the word would be, so I settled on this one, but I want to notice that the phrase love the sinner, hate the sin is superficial. And I mean that in a substantial way. It doesn't consider that there are people at the end of that statement, that there are human lives at the end of that statement. Human beings are not so easily compartmentalized and dismantled into going, there is the human and there is their behavior. There's the sinner and there's the sin. What you call sin, that person may call their identity, their personhood. So sometimes to say love the sinner, hate the sin is actually just another way of saying to that person, I hate you because of who you are or because of what you are. And it's complicated, I know. This isn't as plain as I suggested it might be at the beginning. But Jesus actually simplifies things for us. It's extraordinary. It's plain. He says, do not judge others, and you will not be judged. For you will be treated as you treat others. The standard you use in judging is the standard by which you will be judged. And then this phrase, and why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a log in your own? That bit about the speck and the log is Jesus' warning that our judgment reveals a lot more about us than it does about the people we judge. Our eyes are very revealing parts of our body, so this is really such a clever metaphor. The thing that you pick on in another amplifies the truth about who you are. It reveals the truth about your heart. So Jesus cautions us about a life of judging others. But I cannot finish today without addressing just one final thing, because it has to be not necessarily the elephant in the room, but it is the thing that we can't ignore. We have to ask ourselves the question in closing, do we have the right, in the light of these things, do we have the right to speak into anyone else's life in any way? Is there room for any kind of judgment? If someone in the Christian community causes harm, are we able to respond in any way? Or are we to remain quiet? Are we to remain non-judgmental? I encourage you to go and read 1 Corinthians 5. It's an intriguing chapter on church discipline. It really is. A man in the church is found to be sleeping with his stepmother. And so Paul goes on to say that he has already passed judgment on this man in the name of the Lord. And the man must now be excluded from the fellowship and handed over to Satan. And you can go and read what Paul means by that. And then at the end of the chapter, Paul says he has no business judging those outside of the church. There's no place for him to stand in condemnation of those outside of the church. But he then asks the question and says, surely we have a responsibility to watch over one another within the church. Surely we have a responsibility to watch over one another within the church. So I wonder if I could end today just by summing it up with these three observations. We've said them all. I just want to tie it up for us today. Number one, under Christ, we are not free to judge one another, even if we couch our judgment in religious language. It's off the cards for Jesus. Secondly, I want us to remember, as a way to curtail our inclination towards judgment, because it's very typical human behavior, our judgments reveal a great deal about our own sinfulness. They in fact reveal far more about us than they do about the people we judge. And we should be cautious and think carefully before we are inclined to judge another. And then thirdly and finally, within the Christian community, there is a need for us to offer loving guidance, direction, and sometimes even judgment, to use the biblical word, to protect and to maintain the well-being of all within the community. It is not inappropriate to do so. It's not a simple way forward, but if we listen to Jesus, if we listen to the heart of Jesus, we do not judge one another, but we love one another. And God bless you.